Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome back to another shudder-inducing episode of our scary stories. I am your host, the Keeper of Nightmares and the Weaver of Dark Tales. Tonight, we venture deep into the realms of sleep and shadows. Get comfortable, though not too comfortable. You're going to want to stay wide awake for this one. Grab your blankets, dim your lights, and prepare yourselves as we delve into a story that might just keep you up all night. Let's begin the sleepless. Dr. Catherine Linfield, known as Kate to her colleagues, sat in her sterile university lab surrounded by an aura of faint sterility. Charts and graphs depicting sleep cycles decorated the walls, and the soft hum of machinery filled the air. Her hand wavered over a stack of e-greetings, each squiggly line a testament to someone's restless night. The cool air of the lab seemed to seep into her bones, tightening her shoulders and deepening her frown. Kate's eyes lifted to the news broadcast on her computer, images of people in bed, restless, haunted by insomnia. A scrolling ticker at the bottom warned, insomnia epidemic, no end in sight. As a sleep researcher, her own mind buzzed with a mixture of professional curiosity and dread. She couldn't help but think about the waves of patients she had seen recently, all complaining of sleepless nights, dark circles eating away at their faces, revealing both their exhaustion and a trace of growing desperation. In another part of the city, Mark found himself battling through yet another insomniac night in his cramped apartment. The walls were closing in. The dim lighting from his single lamp seemed both too bright and too dim all at once. It cast long, stretching shadows that slithered and danced across the walls as if mocking his wakefulness. The weight of his tired eyes conflicted with his racing mind. A cruel paradox. Turning off his lamp, he tossed and turned in bed, feeling the abrasive sheets against his skin. Each toss in turn fed the shadows in the room, making them grow like loathsome flowers. "It's just a trick of the eye," he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. The shadows didn't seem so ordinary tonight. They had a texture, a density. They seemed alive. Sophie's room was a stark contrast to the dim monotony of Mark's apartment. Posters of mythical creatures, sketches of eerie landscapes, and strings of garlic adorned her walls. The room smelled faintly of incense and old books. Tonight, her computer screen glowed with the light of a dozen open browser tabs, each dedicated to folklore and myths and tales of shadowy entities. Sophie wore a look of intense focus as her fingers danced over her keyboard. She had always believed in the unknown, the unseen. But these reports of mass insomnia intrigued her more than any ghost story ever had. "They can't sleep, and they start to see things," she whispered to herself, her voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. But what if they are actually seeing something? Back in her lab, Dr. Kate Linfield analyzed the data before her. It wasn't adding up. The neural activity was unusual. The subjects weren't just lacking sleep. Their brainwaves were similar to those experiencing heightened levels of stress and fear. What would be causing this pattern was beyond her, but the science hinted at something out of the ordinary. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as if trying to squeeze out an idea. And then she froze. The feeling was sudden, as though the temperature had plummeted in a heartbeat. Her eyes darted around the lab, and they met something in the far corner of the room. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, darker than night itself, seemed to detach itself from the wall. It wasn't just a void, it was a presence, an entity that wore the room's darkness like a cloak. Kate's heart pounded against her ribcage. Her scientific mind screamed for an explanation, but there was none. Not for this. She could feel it, whatever it was, staring at her. And in that singular, electrifying moment, Dr. Catherine Linfield, a woman of science and rationality, felt a creeping dread that defied all logic. And so, in different corners of a city gripped by a plague of insomnia, three souls, Kate, Mark, Sophie, felt the tendrils of an unspeakable fear begin to close around them. But what they didn't yet know was that this was merely the beginning, the first, fragile threads of a darker tapestry yet to be unfurled. Mark's eyes burned as he blinked at the digital clock on his nightstand. 3:17 a.m., it taunted in neon red. His apartment had become a disquieting sanctuary for insomnia, a once comforting space transformed by eerie shadows that seemed to mock him at every corner. The window blinds cast grill-like patterns across the room, and he thought he saw the shadows lurking between them, muttering, curling, whispering in sinister shapes that made his skin crawl. Each breath he took felt thick, as though the air was saturated with an unnamed dread. Every time he closed his eyes in a futile attempt at sleep, the vivid and grotesque shapes behind his eyelids seemed almost worse than the ones his waking eyes beheld. "It's my mind playing tricks," he repeated like a prayer. "It has to be." Sophie adjusted the focus on her digital camera, the lens whirring softly as it found its target. She was outside, patrolling her neighborhood like some sort of paranormal vigilante. The streets were empty, the scattered lamplights casting pools of illumination that seemed to push the darkness away in a reluctant truce. Sophie had draped herself in a cloak of bravery, a thin veil to mask her escalating obsession. Her previous skepticism had been replaced by an insatiable hunger to document the entities, those elusive shadows that more and more people claimed to see. Her fingers felt stiff around her camera, partly from the chill and partly from anticipation. As she turned down an alley between two buildings, her camera beeped softly, indicating low battery. She fumbled with her bag for a replacement and then froze. Her eyes widened in terror as she saw it, a shadow but not just any shadow. A distinct, twisted shape that almost looked human but was grotesquely wrong. She had only moments to react. The camera's flash burst into the darkness, capturing the entity in a photograph. Dr. Kate Linfield's lab had become a sanctuary of the inexplicable, cluttered with ancient texts and scientific journals. The distinction between mythology and neuroscience seemed to blur as she delved deeper into her research. She had scoured libraries and obscure online forums, only to stumble upon arcane manuscripts hinting at sleep being a barrier between realms, sealing away entities of unfathomable darkness. She examined an ancient scroll before her, its paper yellowed and frayed at the edges. Diagrams of human brains were juxtaposed with arcane symbols, and script written in forgotten languages. As she pored over these cryptic messages, trying to stitch together a theory, her skin tingled with both exhilaration and dread. The implications were terrifying yet intriguing. If sleep was the barrier, then the dam had burst, and the floodwaters were closing in. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest as she reviewed the photograph. There it was, the entity caught in an aura of harsh artificial light. Her triumph was short-lived. The air suddenly grew heavy, as if squeezed from her lungs, and the same shadow she had just captured lunged from the screen, almost like a horrific 3D projection. With a guttural shriek, it swiped at her. Instinctively, she raised her arm to shield her face, the talisman she wore glinting briefly before a sensation of scorching cold slashed across her forearm. The shadow recoiled as if burned, dissolving into the chilling blackness of the alley. Sophie gasped, clutching her arm where the entity had struck. No blood, but a mark that looked disturbingly like a frostbite remained. Sophie's knees gave out, and she slumped to the ground, her camera slipping from her trembling hand. The emotional armor she had wrapped herself in shattered to pieces, leaving her exposed to a reality she had only just begun to understand. Her eyes wide in horror, her mind racing in circles, Sophie realized she had ventured too deep into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back. Sophie hesitated for a moment before clicking the upload button. Her video footage, edited to display only the most chilling moments, was about to be exposed to the judgment of the online world. A combination of desperation and newfound purpose surged through her as the video started to gain views. Her inbox filled with an amalgamation of skeptical comments, supportive messages, and even a few scholarly inquiries. Amidst the flood was a message from Mark, detailing his own experiences and asking if they could discuss further. Intrigued, Sophie agreed, and within hours, they found themselves sitting across from each other in a dimly lit cafe. Mark looked weary, bags under his eyes, and his countenance weighed down by exhaustion. "Your footage," he began, clearing his throat, "is the closest thing to what I've been experiencing for weeks." Sophie shuddered, recalling the encounter that led to her footage. "We're not hallucinating, are we?" Mark met her eyes and shook his head. "No, we're tapping into something that's real, and it's horrifying." Dr. Kate Linfield sat in her lab, eyes riveted to the computer screen. Equations and mathematical symbols filled the monitor. Each calculation was like a thread, and she had woven them into a tapestry that displayed a grim truth. She had found the mathematical proof that suggested sleep acted as a kind of seal between dimensions. Her heart pounded as she sent her findings to physicists, mathematicians, and even researchers with a keen interest in the paranormal. Some replied with skepticism, but others offered enough encouraging words to fuel her determination. She leaned back in her chair, glancing at the framed photograph of her daughter on her desk. What kind of world would it be for her child if these entities continued to infiltrate their reality? The weight of her research had never felt so heavy, nor so urgent. Mark and Sophie found themselves scrolling through Dr. Linfield's recently published paper, which had already ignited debate within academic circles and started making its way into mainstream discussion. Sophie traced her finger along the abstract and looked up, her eyes meeting Mark's. "This is it," she said, her voice tinged with a blend of horror and wonder. "If Dr. Linfield is correct, then we've been living a lie. We're not protected. The walls between here and wherever those things come from are crumbling." Mark clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. "Then we need to find a way to rebuild those walls, before it's too late." Dr. Linfield was scanning through her flood of new emails when one subject line caught her eye. "Cease your investigations." Intrigued and slightly alarmed, she clicked on it. The email was brief and devoid of any pleasantries. "Dr. Linfield," it read, "your theories are closer to the truth than you realize, and it's imperative that you cease your research immediately. Some doors are meant to remain closed. You have been warned." Her eyes widened as she reread the message. It was unsigned, untraceable, but the cold seriousness of the tone left a chill that no rational thought could dispel. She was on the precipice of something immense, and as she looked down into the dark abyss her research had opened, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was staring back, daring her to take the next step. The air was thick with desperation. Emergency sirens wailed through the night, like tormented souls crying for release. Social media channels were aflame with eyewitness accounts, strangers united by fear, recounting how nightmarish entities were no longer lurking in corners, but openly stalking their victims. Each new post, each shared video, stoked the fire of a mass hysteria. People who hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks, huddled in candle-lit living rooms, too afraid of what darkness might conceal to even venture upstairs to their bedrooms. Sophie sat alone in her room, poring over ancient texts she had found online. Her encounter had shaken her, but it also fueled her determination to understand, and perhaps combat, these nightmarish beings. Through her research, she stumbled upon references to talismans used in various cultures to ward off evil entities. With painstaking care, she crafted her own talisman out of iron, salt, and incantations she had no way of verifying but chose to trust. She clutched the talisman, felt its cool, metallic surface against her skin, and breathed. It was not much, but it was a barrier, something between her and the unimaginable horrors that sought entry to her world. In her lab, Dr. Kate Linfield pondered the gravity of her situation. She had a daughter to protect, a public teetering on the edge of pandemonium, and an anonymous threat that suggested far-reaching consequences for her work. But how could she halt her research when every fiber of her being cried out for understanding, for a solution? Resolute, she drafted a press release summarizing her findings, sparing no detail. It was risky, but people had a right to know. She hit send and felt an unusual mix of dread and liberation. She had defied the shadowy warning, stepped into the light of her own convictions. Yet as she looked around her empty lab, she knew she had just escalated a battle that had been quietly raging in unseen realms. Dr. Linfield was stepping into her car when she felt it, a piercing gaze that seemed to reach down into her very soul. She hurriedly locked the car doors, gripping her keys like a weapon. Her eyes darted, scanning the dark corners of the parking garage. Just as she was about to start the engine, her car was flooded with light from a vehicle pulling up behind her, blocking her way. Before she could react, masked individuals emerged, their movements swift and coordinated. Her door was yanked open, a cloth imbued with an overpowering scent pressed to her mouth and nose. Her vision blurred, consciousness slipped away. As she faded into darkness, Dr. Linfield realized that her defiance had come at a staggering price. A price not just for her, but perhaps for the fabric of reality itself. And in that fleeting moment before everything went black, she wondered how many dimensions of darkness were now colliding with their own. Sophie paced back and forth in Mark's cramped living room, which was cluttered with caffeine-rich drinks and a labyrinth of cables leading to a desktop overflowing with open tabs on folklore, dimensional theories, and news updates. Mark's bloodshot eyes blinked rapidly as he scanned through data they had accumulated. "We need to find her, Mark." Dr. Linfield was onto something big, something that could maybe even stop this. I know. "Let me think," Mark groaned, rubbing his temples to stave off another migraine. As if mocking their helplessness, a smartphone on the coffee table buzzed with a news alert. Daylight attacks. Shadow entities no longer confined to darkness. Fear had become omniscient, no longer chained to the cycle of night and day. The world outside was a mirror of human dread. Cars sped aimlessly, horns blaring in a futile protest against the newfound chaos. Crowds gathered outside churches, temples, and mosques, sanctuaries that seemed impotent against an enemy that defied understanding. As Sophie and Mark drove through this dissonance, Sophie felt the weight of her talisman against her chest. It was a modest comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Following coordinates Mark had discovered in an encrypted email on a whistleblower website, they arrived at an unmarked building. Armed with little more than Sophie's talisman and Mark's quickly devised electronic lockpicks, they infiltrated the building. Inside, they descended into an underground lab that smelled of antiseptic and old books, a place of learning turned into a prison. There, bound to a chair but still resilient, was Dr. Linfield. A quick exchange of incredulous glances, and then Mark and Sophie were untying her. "We don't have much time," Dr. Linfield said, catching her breath. "They're called the Shadow Consortium. They've known about the entities for years but have kept it secret. They thought they could control it, use it for..." Suddenly, a low growl resonated through the room, drowning her words. A horrific sound that crawled up your spine and made your skin feel like a poor shield against the monstrosities it heralded. The room darkened unnaturally as the temperature dropped, and a nauseating mix of sulfur and rot filled the air. The entities, indistinct yet terrifyingly present, emerged from corners and crevices. Glowing eyes, teeth like shards of obsidian, skeletal forms draped in darkness. The line between nightmare and reality was obliterated in that instant. Sophie clutched her talisman, her knuckles whitening, and Dr. Linfield hastily scribbled what looked like equations in the air using an augmented reality device she had managed to grab. Mark, using a makeshift device assembled from electronic components, tried to generate a frequency to disorient them. For a moment, the entities hesitated, as if confounded, their forms flickering like faulty projections. But it wasn't enough. They lunged forward, and the trio braced themselves for an impact that could transcend realms. But before they made contact, a shockwave emanated from the deepest corner of the lab. The ground trembled, equipment toppled over, and the entities shrieked, an unbearable sound that seemed to come from multiple dimensions at once, as they were hurled back into the shadows from which they emerged. Catching their breath, the trio turned to see an archaic machine, hidden until now, pulsating with energy in the aftermath of the shockwave. But what it was, who had activated it, and what its presence meant for the teetering balance between worlds were questions that hung heavily in the air, adding another layer to their already complex tapestry of fear. Panic still tainted the air in the underground lab as Dr. Linfield, Sophie, and Mark caught their breath. Dr. Linfield's eyes widened as she examined the archaic machine that had mysteriously activated. She hurried over to a nearby console, fingers flying across the keyboard, as cryptic symbols and equations filled the screen. Whatever that machine is, it's ancient and it's powerful. But it's not enough. The entities will return, and in greater numbers, she warned, her voice tinged with urgent clarity. Sophie clutched her talisman, the intricate symbols carved into its surface shimmering faintly. "Can this help? I used it earlier, and it seemed to ward them off temporarily." Dr. Linfield studied the talisman carefully. It's based on ancient geometries that resonate with the fabric of reality. It's essentially a stopgap, not a solution. "We need something more, something permanent," Mark muttered, rubbing his weary eyes, craving sleep that seemed an eternity away. A spark ignited in Dr. Linfield's eyes. "That's it. Sleep. If we can replicate the neurochemical processes of sleep artificially, and apply it on a massive scale, we could potentially reinforce the barrier between dimensions. We need a collective forced sleep." Sophie and Mark exchanged nervous glances, both overwhelmed by the enormity of the task at hand. Hours blurred into minutes as the trio worked fervently, merging ancient symbolism with modern technology, creating an online ritual that could trigger an artificial sleep state. "Are you ready?" Dr. Linfield asked, her cursor hovering over the upload button. Sophie tightened her grip on the talisman, and Mark nodded. "Do it." With a click that echoed in their hearts, the ritual was released into the digital wilderness. Social media exploded. News channels broke their endless loops of chaos to report this new solution. Skepticism abounded, but the desperation of sleepless nights overrode doubt. Slowly, people began participating. Sophie, Mark, and Dr. Linfield stood in the lab, their eyes fixed on multiple screens displaying global participation in real time. It was working. The ritual was spreading like digital wildfire. Then, in a moment that stretched the boundaries of belief, the world sighed. The entities, those indescribable beings of darkness, wavered as if struggling against an invisible force. And then, with a sound like the crumbling of dimensions, they vanished. The room felt lighter, the air less oppressive. Across the world, screens displayed the words everyone longed to see. Ritual successful. People could sleep again. In the aftermath, mainstream media explained away the insomnia epidemic as a mass psychological event, a curious footnote in the annals of an increasingly strange world. But Sophie, Mark, and Dr. Linfield knew better. Gathered once again in Mark's living room, they watched as the news flashed images of recovering patients and joyful reunions. "We know the truth," Sophie whispered, still clutching her talisman. "We do," agreed Dr. Linfield. "And while the barrier between worlds has been restored, it's up to us to make sure it stays that way." "So, what now?" Mark asked, the weight of sleeplessness slowly lifting from his eyes. "Now," said Dr. Linfield, looking at the young faces that had helped save a world teetering on the brink of nightmares, "we become the guardians of the unknown." And in that quiet room, surrounded by books, talismans, and the ever-present screens, they each felt a newfound sense of purpose. The world had been pulled back from the edge of darkness, but they knew their vigilance was just beginning. And so, dear listeners, we close the door on the realm of sleepless nights and lurking shadows, at least for now. Though the line between dimensions has been sealed, the vigilance must remain, for the boundaries of reality are never truly safe. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through our scary stories. Do give yourself permission to sleep tonight, but remember, some doors are best left unopened. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.